Welcome to the first episode of the Dragon Ball Super Weekly Staff Roundup, where I take a look at each episode as it comes out each week, and take a look at exactly who animated what, who did this, who did that, and what to expect from the next episode. Today we are covering episode 65. This is the first time we have seen Naoki Tate and Osamu Ishikawa working together since episode 47. Tate's last episode was episode 56, while Ishikawa's was 59. What's quite strange, and something I noticed as soon as we sort of hit the midway point of the episode, is that Ishikawa isn't really felt particularly strongly in this episode. In fact, Naoki Tate animates almost all of the episodes, and it's kind of odd as Tate had just finished a good portion on episode 63 in fact, and he was also providing cuts for the opening of Toei's new show Tiger Mask W. As a result, there's not actually a whole lot of detailed combat, none of the fancy stuff that we're really used to from Tate. Instead, he actually focuses on delivering an episode that is packed to the brim with beautiful effects work. And to really define effects work, I guess, for people who aren't super into animation, effects generally encompasses things like smoke, beams, debris, water, that kind of thing, things that stand outside of the principal animation. So from the very get-go, we get some wonderful effects as Zamos powers up. You can see Tate's recognizable shapes really clearly here, and it's something that I suppose we haven't seen as clearly as this since episode 2 of Super. It's kind of hard to showcase what good and bad effects are, but I guess if we use this scene from later in the episode from a planar animator, you can see that the effects are a lot blander. You don't quite get the same artistic flair that Tate's have. The shapes are a little bit more standard, not quite as interesting, and so it's really great to see Tate throwing out something that he is so good at, even if it's in such a small portion such as this. It looks wonderful, as you can see. But before we get to some of the meatier stuff, we actually cut away from the action to the underground where Yajirobe and the rest of the survivors are. There's nothing particularly defining about these scenes. I don't want to dwell on them too long, but both here and throughout a lot of the episode, anything that doesn't really involve the main action seems to be where the rest of the staff were handling things. There's actually a crazy number of animators on this episode, and yet so much of it is animated by Tate, and so it kind of seems like most of the animators probably handled only a short number of cuts each just to sort of get things done, sort of to finish off the episode, I suppose. But at the very least, this does seem to be where Ishikawa's attention was for the most part, though I have to say there are some surprising scenes that do feature Tate's touch. What's really interesting actually is that in the middle of these scenes there's some reused effects animation from episode 47. We've been seeing this quite a lot in Super lately, and in this episode especially, not only do they reuse stuff from older episodes, they're actually reusing cuts within it over and over again, the biggest example being things like Zamos throwing his attacks. Well, this is definitely a smart thing to do, and it's something I've been wanting them to do for a really long time. When you think about this in conjunction with sort of how many animation-less episodes we've had in the midst of all of this good stuff, it's definitely very plain to see that the production is struggling a little bit with delivering on this action-filled finale. Unfortunately, this does kind of extend to this episode too, and while I do want to get back to the positives of this episode since, there are a lot and I thoroughly enjoyed it, it's definitely worth noting that almost everybody's work is very rough, and so we do have second key animators on this episode and the chief supervisor too, really helping to redraw work and finish up pieces of animation so that everything looks a little bit more polished than perhaps it would have done without them. What this does mean though is that you end up with instances where something is moving like one animator, but the art is someone else's entirely. We actually saw this last week in the very opening scene where Masahiro Shimanuki, of all people, cleaned up Higashide's work, uncredited too. But back to the effects work, back to the good stuff. There are a bunch of great cuts throughout this episode, tons of opportunities for Tate to show off a side of him that we so rarely see in Super. This all comes together for one major cut where Goku and Vegeta fly at Zamos. There are beams, there are smoke, there's treating, a cartoon like a cartoon, where Zamos grabs their fists, and it's all really wonderful. I absolutely adore it, and even though it's not as sort of packed with animation as I would have liked to see from Tate, I kind of understand given that this is very clearly a rushed episode. From here, we get Futoshi Higashide's first major contribution as Trunks powers up. Higashide is, of course, the very talented animator I mentioned earlier, who has animated on just about every episode of this arc. He's been responsible for significantly raising the quality of the show as a whole. Like the majority of his contributions this week, he doesn't actually do too much here. It's mostly just close-ups, and like Tate's been doing throughout this entire episode, he uses quite a lot of effects to mask the lack of movement. But something that's really cool, and this is probably from Hatano Kohei's storyboard rather than Higashide's layout. It's the Obari pose when Trunks pulls out his sword. If you don't know, this is a dramatic pose that was made famous by an animator called Masami Obari. It was very prevalent in the Gundam series. Yeah, it's not groundbreaking in this episode, but, you know, as an animation fan, it was very cool to see. But anyway, Higashide, he animated the lead up to the Gallic Cannon. He did pretty much everything from Trunks powering up right through to Trunks posing with the Gallic Cannon before firing it, at which point it does actually switch across to Tate, where we get this wonderful scene, really great angle, beautiful effects work. It is a looping scene, but of course it does look great and it does convey that sense of scale that the scene requires, so can definitely forgive it for being sort of conservative in its effects work. From here on out, it is pretty much all Tate, though we do get one Ishikawa close-up that's very nice. I did use it last week in the preview. To wrap things up, we do get this one cut of Zamas that I have no idea who drew. Like, it's entirely off-model, and it kind of looks like a Procure villain, but I sort of love it for that reason. But yeah, that's it. That's the episode, and we then head into what is possibly the most exciting next episode preview that this series has ever seen. We've got the return of Naotoshi Shida, who animated that wonderful scene in episode 57. We've got Ken Otsuka on Twitter confirming that he's back. There's also Masahiro Shimanuki looking like his old Z work, and possibly even more Higashide. Honestly, I'm so excited. I cannot wait to cover next week. It's going to be an absolute blast. But thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of this episode in the comments section below. Let me know if you like this idea for a series, and I will see you next time.